The English History Plays of Shakespeare, Part 1. The history plays of Shakespeare are many, but here we are talking about the English history plays. The English history plays of Shakespeare are based on the lives of English kings, and these are the kings that figure in Shakespeare's history plays: King John, Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, Richard III, and Henry VIII. They cover approximately quite a long time. 1199, that is the beginning of 13th century or the end of 12th century up to mid 16th century. The whole period of English history that we call Middle Ages is kind of covered by the history plays of Shakespeare, beginning with the story of King John, who signed Magna Carta, or rather who placed his royal seal on the Magna Carta, to the time when Queen Elizabeth was born. His plays cover the whole of Middle English period or the Middle Ages. It shows the glory and the seamy side and the decline of the medieval English history. We have the rose here, which combines red and white. This is the Tudor rose. So the story finally ends. His history plays conclude with the Tudor ascendancy in England and the birth of Queen Elizabeth I. Shakespeare's history plays are not accurate history. They are driven by the patriotism typical of the days of Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth tried to promote a kind of national pride among the people, and Shakespeare tapped on that patriotic fervor of the people to give them what they wanted. And his history plays were enormously successful when he staged them. And we know that Shakespeare was a businessman, besides being a brilliant writer and a poet. And he had an eye for the business possibilities of the stage, and he cashed in on that. So he also tried to please his patrons and to keep his um, clientele entertained. And history plays of Shakespeare need to be read keeping all these things in mind. They're not precisely history, but there is a lot of history in them. Shakespeare's sources for his history plays were primarily the Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, published in 1577 by Raphael Holinshed. This book, published in several volumes, see you have first volume cover here, there was another volume that followed, uh, is popularly called Holinshed's Chronicles. So Shakespeare based all his English history plays on the information in Holinshed's Chronicles, but he took a lot of liberties and he brought in characters from his imagination and made them very, very rich, as he always does. There is another book, another anonymous play that was published around that time in England, 1584, titled The Famous Victories of Henry V, which also was a basic text for a few of Shakespeare's English history plays. And he probably depended on other books as well, because Shakespeare was not always worried about originality, and very often he depended on the existing texts, an existing play written by a colleague or somebody uh, of little repute. He and his friends would take them up and embellish them, and that was customary of Shakespeare. We always give a lot of importance to Shakespeare's tragedies and comedies. and we think of the last plays, but his history plays form a class of their own with some of the most memorable characters that Shakespeare created, like Richard II, like Richard III, like Falstaff, the comic character, the comic genius, and his plays have moments of intense drama, as in King John involving Queen Constance, as in Richard II involving the king and his confusions, in Richard III, in Henry IV, not to mention Henry IV, several moments of intense dramatic tension, which are almost as intense as in his tragedies. There are also hilariously comic situations, particularly in the Henry IV Part 1 play, which we all often talk about, involving Falstaff and others, and also sublimely poetic moments. Some of the most remarkable poetry of Shakespeare could be found in his history plays. We will see that. Behind the history plays, there was this belief which was common in the medieval period and which still existed during Shakespeare's time, the belief in the great chain of being. People believed, and people were made to believe by the church, that God was the supreme. Of all creations, God ruled supreme. Below God would come angels and demons. And then on the earth, you have human beings, you have animals, you have plants, stuff like that, non living things. Of these, man happens to be the supreme creation. And of men, the king was the head. And the king, this is a belief that was still very much strong in the Elizabethan period, that the king was someone who was anointed by God. And this was drawn from the Bible. There are many instances of God personally sending his priest to anoint the king. And here we have an image of Samuel anointing Saul. So the English people believed that the king was anointed by God, and somebody who tried to oust the king was in for trouble. And if a king was wrongfully ousted from his place, or even rightly ousted from the place, if his place, if that is possible, anarchy would result. The country will see great disturbances in the form of civil war, pestilences perhaps. And we have these lines in Richard II, where the king, who is facing imminent usurpation, talks about how he cannot be removed from his position. Not all the water in the rough rude sea can wash the balm off from the anointed king. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. So this was the belief that ran strong even in the Elizabethan times. And English history plays have this as a strong theme, recurring theme behind it. And Shakespeare lived at a time when Queen Elizabeth was the monarch, and she did not marry, she did not have children. People had deep inside the fear of what will happen once she dies. Will the country again sink into anarchy as it had seen many decades before the Tudors asserted their strong rule with Henry VII, a century before? So the English history plays are King John, which is the first, Richard II, another play. Henry IV has two parts. So the Henry IV are two plays. Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2. Henry V is another play. Henry VI has again three parts. Richard III and Henry VIII. We need to remember that the first, which is King John, was also probably the first play in the history series that Shakespeare wrote. And the last play, which is one of Shakespeare's own last plays, written after Queen Elizabeth died and written in collaboration probably with Fletcher, King John and Henry VIII are two standalone plays. They stand separate, while these plays have some kind of organic relation with one another. Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and Henry V talk about the story of Henry V primarily, the growth and coming into power of Henry IV. In Richard I, we see Henry, the cousin of Richard, ousting Richard II and becoming the king as Henry IV, and then he establishes a strong rule and rules for quite a long time, but he is deeply troubled by his act of deposing a God anointed king, and the fear of civil war and tribulations always troubled Henry IV. Throughout this period, we see a young person named Prince Hal growing up, apparently in a desolate manner without paying any heed to his duties as a prince, showing no promise of greatness as a future king. And then we see Henry emerge as a very strong and promising young king in Henry V. So these, how many plays are the one, two, three, four plays? They together form one tetralogy. And then we have the second tetralogy, which are Henry VI, three parts, and Richard III, together forming the second tetralogy. People sometimes call this the first tetralogy because this, chronologically, this comes first. These four plays come first. Richard I, Henry IV, 1, 2, and Henry V. And some people call this as the first tetralogy because Henry VI, three parts, and Richard III were the plays that Shakespeare wrote first in the order in which his plays were written. But we will not look at the order in which these plays were written. We will look at Shakespeare's history plays, English history plays, in the chronological order in which the kings lived. So we have Henry VI, a weak king who during whose period there was a lot of trouble, the long period of war which we call the Wars of the Roses, and the war with France was going on at this time. And finally out of this chaos emerges a monster, at least Shakespeare presents him as a monster, who is Richard III, who, though monstrous in some ways, also has great gift of poetry. He talks some of the great lines in Shakespeare's plays, Richard III. And in the last part of that play, we find Richard being defeated, and Henry VII, the grandfather of Elizabeth I, becoming the ruler, uniting the two houses of York and Lancaster and establishing finally peace in the country. So that is how the plays go. And after that, this Henry VIII stands apart as a play which talks about the early rule of Henry VIII, and the play concluding with the birth of Queen Elizabeth. So that is a brief survey of these history plays of Shakespeare, and we will look at the individual plays of Shakespeare in the next part on English history plays of Shakespeare. Thank you.